Hi, my name is Damon. I'm the author of the Standard Theory of Psychology. I've created a couple different resources surrounding standard theory, including some books, some graphics, and some table versions, as well as the Standard Behavioral Index. But what I want to do now is add some video resources that are a little less formal and hopefully a little easier to follow when it comes to standard theory, explaining what it's saying, and presenting the Standard Behavioral Index. So over the next few videos, what I really want to do is explain the index and explain all the specific parts of it and describe exactly what it can do in terms of evaluating behavior and how it's related to the other things that we already know in psychology. So standard theory is supposed to be an all-in-one theory. You can think of it as a singular theory or a unified theory or a universal theory, but essentially what I'm trying to present is one single set of rules that allows you to think of the brain and behavior and all of its parts using an unchanging foundation. And that includes things like neurochemistry, things like physiology, things like emotions and behavior and relationships and all kinds of different things. There's embedded diagnostic criteria that allows you to look at things like mental illness and how bad they may be. And it's really designed to address any given person. And it's very different from what things are usually addressed traditionally, especially through empirical study and through peer review and so on. But it's just a presentation of my own understanding of psychology and the way that I would organize those problems and the way that I would approach them. And the most important thing is that the theory is able to address and provide language for all of the different types of things out there, all the different fields of study and so forth, and doing so without changing the rules, without having to consider a different set of things or without having to have a condition. And another aspect of standard theory is addressing those processes beyond things like culture, beyond things like gender, beyond things like language, and all those other barriers. And if standard theory does everything it's supposed to, we should have a very good way of addressing those things, not only in psychiatry, but also psychology and neurology and behavior analysis and counseling and all kinds of different areas. And it's really designed to unify our understanding and to unify the study of people and behavior in general. So over the next few videos, I plan to introduce the Standard Behavioral Index to give a little bit of oversight as to what the index is organizing and what it's saying, and from there introduce the specific ideas and the specific units that standard theory is based on, and hopefully apply standard theory to the things that have already been done, and hopefully give some insight as to how we can use it as a tool moving forward. So I hope you enjoy the videos, and I'd like to thank you for watching, and I hope that you enjoy standard theory. So this is a Standard Behavioral Index, and before we get started and go any deeper, there are two main things that we need to talk about, and one of them is the idea that everything on the Behavioral Index is based on a specific unit. It's based on a specific amount of information, and that amount of information is very commonly referred to as a cycle of communication. And that's one unit of resolution, it's one unit of experience, and has a specific dimensionality to it. So that's one really important thing to keep in mind as we go through the index, is that everything that is on here is based on that one specific unit. That's kind of our starting space, that's kind of square one. So the second thing that's really important is something called the concept of faculty. So each person uses a specific modality to process information. They have their own way of dealing with their experiences, and standard theory organizes those in a specific way. And it's very difficult because you may find as an individual that you're somewhere along the lines of this thing, but unfortunately we have to start at the very beginning, at the most basic, and then kind of work our way up to the more complex things. So even if the first part maybe doesn't resonate with you or doesn't make sense, there's a very good chance that the other aspects of it may. But unfortunately, we have to start at the very beginning and kind of work our way to where you might be, or where you may view other people, or how you sort of resonate with what may be going on. So those are two of the most important things to keep in mind, is the idea that everything is here is based on a unit of experience. It's a specific building block. And the second thing is to understand that there are different thinking types, or different modalities, or different faculties that people use in order to handle their own experiences. So we're going to go ahead and draw the behavioral index, and we'll touch on those two things, the idea that there's a specific unit, and then we'll also run through the different faculties that are organized on here. So the first idea that's really important to consider when learning standard theory is the idea that there's a specific unit of information. And to keep up with that, there's something called the Z0 scale, or the Z0 scale. And that's this right here in the center. And the unit that we use is referred to as a cycle of communication. And that cycle of communication has specific parts to it. So you have to experience all three of those parts to get a single unit of experience. And that's what we use this for, is to organize the components of impulse. That's kind of what they're referred to. So the three components that we have are impulse, subtraction, and compression. And once you have all three of those things, you consider that experience, that specific amount of information, to be resolved. And every time that happens, you end up with a single unit of experience. And that single unit is going to define how we organize everything else that's in the behavioral index. And the very general term for any resolution of experience, or any experience in general, is going to be referred to as a cycle of communication. And that gives us our most fundamental unit, and that's the standard that we're going to use to observe behavior, and the index is going to organize what we observe based on that unit specifically. So besides the idea that there's one specific unit, there's also the concept of faculty, and that's the idea that people are going to use different modalities to understand what's going on with them. And those modalities are organized based on scales. So the standard behavioral index uses 3 scales primarily, and the one that defines that unit, the one that gives us the definition for what our unit is referred to as a Z0 scale, or the Z0 scale. So the Z0 scale is one of the scales. So this part that's sort of a horizontal bit here is referred to as the R scale, which is short for the Rose scale. And then we also have this vertical bit right here, and that's the Z scale. And these describe the primary modalities that people use to process information and to handle their experiences. The Z0 scale is what's going to define our unit of experience. The R scale is going to describe something that's referred to as intelligence. And intelligence is essentially the act of using the internalized units of experience. You kind of reactivate that experience, then you reactivate some other unrelated experience that's already been internalized, and then you make a new connection in between them. And the ability to do that is what defines the entire scale of intelligence. So that's kind of the primary dynamic. And doing that individually with a single experience and a single experience, both of which have been experienced by the individual, doing that is the lowest threshold of intelligence. And some people may not start there. They may start somewhere else, and those are essentially described by the different communication types in the R scale. But it organizes how people utilize that phenomenon and process those units of information by connecting them together to provide meaning to otherwise random experience. And finally, there's the Z scale, which is a scale of post-intelligent impulse. So once you have access to the R scale, and once you make connections between things, eventually you're going to hit a limit. And once you hit that limit, everything that happens in the R scale is going to become compressed and it's going to become transmuted, and determining how a person utilizes their experiences, how they utilize their internal stimulation, how they organize external stimulation, and so forth, is all going to be organized on the Z scale. And it's a little bit different than just pure environmental experience, because there are memories involved in it, there's internal stimulation involved in it, there are relationships and so on. But it's just a different way that people go about experiencing information, when they can also consider their internalized information, their internal experiences, and what they've made meaning of, versus just being left to random chance in the environment. So it's very similar to what defines our unit. It's based on the Z0 scale, but there are a few more capabilities that people have whenever they get to post-intelligent impulse, because it's not just environmental experience, it's internal experience and environmental experience, and trying to make sense of what they're going through based on both of those things. So the Z0 scale is going to define our unit, which is also going to be a cycle of communication. The R scale is going to give us intelligence, where we combine the cycles of communication to make new internalized meaning. And the Z scale is going to give us a way to organize what happens in post-intelligence after we hit the limit. And we use our previous experiences as well as the environment to make sense of what's going on. So what you may find is one of these may resonate with you more than another. You may be more apt to use one type or another, but people have the capacity to utilize any of them so long as all of the prerequisites and all the conditions are met. But essentially what standard theory is going to do is take this unit of communication, the cycle of communication, and follow it all the way through, and then basically back around again. And everything that standard theory talks about is what happens when it's done in the most optimal sense, meaning that the brain has all the things it needs, all the energy it needs, has all the information, it's in the right environment, and all the right relationships are there. It's the best case scenario, as it were. And that is what we're going to use to define what our baseline is, what normal meditation is, and what the absolute standardization of thinking would look like. And from there, anything that deviates from that can be considered abnormal. And it can start all the way at the cycle of communication, or at our basic unit, or it can happen somewhere in intelligence, or it can happen somewhere in post-intelligence. But anytime you get anything that deviates from what the standard says, then you can just consider that abnormal, and it makes it very easy to pinpoint why it happened. So now that we have those two primary concepts, the idea that everything is based on a unit, and the idea that there are different modalities and different thinking types, different aspects of the index, the next thing we're going to do is describe each individual aspect. And what I'll do to begin with is just label everything. There are about 24 individual parts to this. We'll label everything, and then from there we should be able to identify and define the components of impulse. Then we can talk about all of the aspects of intelligence, and then all of the aspects of post-intelligence. And there's also the organization of memory, which is referred to as cyclic thinking, that will be addressed. And finally, complex communication, which is a special case that happens beyond post-intelligence. Okay, so we'll draw the behavioral index and label all the different parts. So here we have the index. I'll try to start from the most basic and kind of work our way up. So here we have the index. We'll start with this here, which is the Z0 scale. And in the Z0 scale, we have the components of impulse, which are impulse, subtraction, and compression. So, impulse, subtraction, and compression. That's the Z0 scale. So here we have the R scale, or the scale of intelligence. And what I'm going to try to do is extend all the way from the R scale and work our way down. So we'll just label this as the R scale. And the R scale is organized using thinking types and communication types. And then finally we get down to the individual units. So they're sort of organized based on general to a little more specific to even more specific. So in the R scale, there are 3 primary thinking types. 1, 2, and 3. And we'll go ahead and just give these a label: capital A, capital B, and capital C. And then within each thinking type, there are communication types. And that's what these lines here represent. These lines here represent communication types. We'll label these with Roman numerals. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then within each of these types, there are specific units. And standard theory numbers those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It also numbers them first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, ninth, eighth, seventh, and so on. But the individual units that the Z scale describes, and then that that have to be combined in order to access intelligence, are organized based on their specific number. So first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. So we'll go ahead and label these. So the first thinking type in the R scale is referred to as horizontal thinking. The second thinking type, that's labeled B, is orthogonal thinking. And the third thinking type is absolute thinking. So in the R scale, there are 3 thinking types. There's horizontal thinking, there's orthogonal thinking, and there's absolute thinking. So each of the lines in the behavioral index that are actually written on the graphic are going to organize the communication types, which are a little bit more specific. And each thinking type has a subtype, which is a communication type. So within horizontal thinking, standard theory organizes 3 communication types. And those are silent communication as the first one. The second one is intimate communication. And the third one is social communication. And in orthogonal thinking, there's one communication type, and that is shared communication. And in absolute thinking, there's one communication type, and that's super social. So the R scale is the scale of intelligence, and that dynamic is taking our individual units from the Z0 scale and combining them into unique internalized ideas. And when you do that, you can observe specific phenomenon that people go through. And those phenomena are organized based on the thinking type, based on the communication type, and within each communication type are the individual units that we see. So the first time you do that from the lowest threshold, it's referred to as the first characteristic of communication. So the term characteristic is the unit that the cycle of communication is related to in intelligence. The same way the Z0 scale defines our unit or defines our cycle of communication, in the R scale, combining those units is referred to as a characteristic. And within each thinking type, there are communication types, and within each communication types, there's going to be a specific number of units that are observed there. So in silent communication, you're going to deal with the first, second, and third characteristics. In intimate communication, you deal with fourth, fifth, and sixth, and social is ninth, eighth, and seventh. So we'll have that. It's going to be silent communication, which can be first, second, and third characteristics. And intimate communication, we're going to deal with fourth, fifth, and sixth characteristics. And then in social communication, we have ninth, eighth, and seventh characteristics. So when we look at the R scale, we can look at the type of thinking that's involved, and then we can look at the type of communication within that thinking type, and then we can look at the specific unit, the specific process of combining those things. And every time we combine those things, we think of it as a characteristic. When we combine something that furthers that process, we think of it as an additional characteristic, and we just observe what happens from there. And that is what defines each characteristic as we move along. So orthogonal thinking has its own communication type, which is shared communication, and it more or less relies on the horizontal characteristics. And there's a certain dynamic that goes along with shared communication, and because of that dynamic, you don't necessarily get a single characteristic, you get a shared characteristic. But if you want to observe those in the same stepwise fashion, what you observe is going to be a range of characteristics, and that's something that is best described when we get a little bit deeper into the specific thinking types and the communication types. But the range that we see in orthogonal thinking and in shared communication is going to be from 10 characteristics all the way to 17 characteristics. That's the range that defines how orthogonal thinking is experienced. And the dynamic that dictates that is very similar to the overall dynamic, which is creating new connections between experiences, but there's a little bit alternate way that it happens, and that's best described when we get a little bit deeper into orthogonal thinking and shared communication. So finally, we have absolute thinking. And absolute thinking has one communication type, which is referred to as supersocial communication. And this also differs a little bit from horizontal and orthogonal thinking when looking at things stepwise. And what we're looking at are groups of ideas at that point. And once again, it's a little bit easier to describe that once we get a little bit deeper into the thinking and communication types. But instead of there being a stepwise set of characteristics, there are sort of what you can think of as hot spots or nodes or kind of stepping stones that allows you to move back and forth within that thinking type. So in absolute thinking, we have supersocial communication, and there are 4 primary characteristics that deals with. So those are 25, 27, 54, and 117. And each one of these are sort of their own characteristic, but they're formed through collections of ideas. So it's a little bit different than what we see going on in the other ones, but those are the points at which the brain tries to consider that information and figures out what to do with it. And it's still related to the idea of taking ideas and making connections between them, but there's its own dynamic that happens there. So this is essentially the entirety of the R scale. This is all that we can do when it comes to the Faculty of Intelligence. So we'll sort of work back through this, so hopefully we can get a better idea of how it's organized. So in the R scale, we have thinking types, which are the horizontal thinking type, the orthogonal thinking type, and the absolute thinking type. And in the original diagram, these aren't going to be labeled. The only thing you're going to get are these bars here that represent the communication types. So within each thinking type, we have a communication type. And in horizontal, the communication types are silent, intimate, and social. Then here, under orthogonal communication, under orthogonal thinking, we have shared communication. And here in absolute thinking, we have supersocial communication. So each one of these bars represents the communication types. And these lines, which aren't included in the monogram of the index, are going to be the thinking types. So if we go to the most general, we have the R scale, which is a Faculty of Intelligence. We have each thinking type, we have each communication type, and then within each communication type, we have the individual characteristics. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 8, 7, the range from 10 through 17, and then we have 25, 27, 54, and 117. So what each one of these numbers of individual characteristics are saying is that there's an observable phenomenon that happens at each one of these characteristics. And each observable phenomenon is organized under the communication type, which is part of the thinking type, which is in the Faculty of Intelligence. And each characteristic has its own specific name. And each specific characteristic has its own set of associated phenomenon that is observable. The same way you can learn to observe a symptom or something like that, you can learn to recognize which characteristic a person is displaying, which one they're using to communicate, and so forth. And the more specific you get, the more you kind of have to explain that phenomenon. But the reason they're organized in that way is because each communication type shares a specific dynamic, the same way that each thinking type shares a dynamic, but all that is going to be based on the Faculty of Intelligence, which is combining ideas and using those internalizations to create something unique or something new. And as we move on, we'll define what each of these characteristics are, how we name them, and what's associated with each one of them. And what we're looking for is a standardization of those things. So we're looking at what happens when you progress through each one of those characteristics in a congruent and symmetric way. And we want to make sure that the phenomenon that we observe is happening to completion or to resolution. And anytime you get anything that does not fall in the specific standardized unit, you can consider it to be abnormal. And from there, it's much easier to see what is not considered a standard process. It's very easy to see what is non-standard or what is abnormal. So if you notice, one thing about this organization is it starts kind of from smallest and increases. It's not exactly linear in that way, as we can discuss a little bit later, but more or less it kind of tends to increase. And one thing that's really important to recognize is the idea that there's a limit to what is possible when carrying out these processes of combining information. And that limit is recognized by this thing here. And this weird whole circle looking thing is referred to as the gap. And that's this whole thing right here. This circle here, this thing. This is the gap. And there are a couple ways that standard theory defines that, and there are a couple of traditional ways to define why this happens. But at some point, once you continually add these ideas together and put more and more stress on the brain, once you expend all the energy required to do all that, eventually the brain is going to try to slow you down. It's going to try to prevent that amount of energy consumption from happening. And there are a couple of other things that surround why that happens, but it's sort of a physical limit of what we're able to do in intelligence. And once we get to the gap, we're sort of locked out of our faculty of intelligence temporarily. And that's just the way that the brain has evolved to protect itself from overworking itself. And there are several other things that we can discuss related to that in terms of neurochemistry and the structures that handle all that and so forth. But it's denoted by this sort of circular thing here, and it's sort of the switch between, like, kind of like the tipping point between intelligence and the faculty of post-intelligence. So the same way that we can move from our individual unit of impulse and open our faculty for intelligence, we also close a faculty for intelligence and move to the Z scale, which is referred to as the faculty of post-intelligence or just the faculty of impulse. So this gap is what marks the separation between our capacity for intelligence and our capacity for post-intelligence. And it's very important that you recognize that for several reasons when evaluating behavior, but it is a physical limit, and it marks the separation between the R scale and the Z scale. So we've got our individual unit here, we defined that. We've defined the thinking types and the communication types and their associated characteristics. We've learned about the gap that separates intelligence from post-intelligence. So now we will define each one of these in post-intelligence by labeling everything on the Z scale. So what we have here is the Z scale. And this entire thing from the gap all the way down here is the Z scale. And it's different from the Z naught scale. The Z naught scale is just defining our unit. The Z scale is also dealing with the entire process of impulse, but it's defined in combination with our experiences in intelligence. So the Z scale is just a scale of impulse. The Z naught scale is defining our unit, and the Z scale alone is going to give us the ranges of communication that we use once we've gone through intelligence. So the Z naught scale has nothing to do with combining information and using internalizations. It's all about environmental experience. So the Z naught scale is environment only. The Z scale is not only environment, but internalization as well. And there are a couple of primary parts to the Z scale. So the first one is going to be here, this kind of range where these bars are, and we'll label that A lowercase. And then we have this spot where there are not any bars, and we'll label that B lowercase. And then we have this sort of slanted line, and that is our third part, which we'll label C lowercase. And the same way that we had thinking types here, we basically have the thinking types here. It's a little easier to also think of them as communication types because we're not necessarily making new combinations of things, but these are organized based on the dynamics that define them. And if we want to label them, the lowercase a is going to be referred to generally as post-intelligent impulse. That's generally going to be the way that you define these different bars. And within each one of these, we have a specific range of communication. And we'll label those with lowercase Roman numerals, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And each one of these has a referential name. And the first one is going to be metaphysical communication. And the second one is going to be impulsive communication. Third one, compulsive communication. And the fourth one, compulsive impulse. And this is what you can consider the normal range of the Z-scale. The same way that you think of things being congruent and happening normally. If everything's going the way it should, you should progress through these stages. And there's a little more explaining that has to be done as to why these are what you expect to see. But that's best discussed when we get a little bit deeper in there. The other area of the Z-scale for this lowercase b is going to be referred to as rolling communication. And then the lowercase c down here is part of complex communication. And it's very difficult to say that these are abnormal. They more or less fit into the category of being non-congruent. But once again, they have their own dynamic, and it requires a little bit of explanation as to why that dynamic happens. So it's really important to separate them because you essentially are going in different directions with them. And complex communication is beyond what is going to be what you consider meaningful. So thinking back to the R scale, there are thinking types, there are communication types, and then within each one of those there are specific characteristics or specific units. And the Z scale, it's very similar. There are specific units, but they're organized a little bit differently, and that is based on the fact that you have to go through the gap, kind of close that faculty to get to this point. And even so, there are specific characteristics, or what you can refer to as cycles of communication, that describe where you are in terms of the different communication types. So when you first cross the gap in a normal sense without any other weird thing happening, in a standard sense, where you start there is essentially at negative 180 characteristics. You can also refer to that as negative 180 cycle characteristics, or negative 180 cycles of communication. But that's the way that we label the baseline status after you get through the gap. And there's a range that you use in order to handle that faculty. And it's based on, sometimes on internalizations, sometimes it's based on external processes, sometimes it's based on an emotion or relationship, but there's essentially a certain range that you have to handle that information in any normal sense. And that range goes from negative 180 all the way to negative 185. And the way that we define those cycles of communication are going to be based on our individual unit. So every time you initiate an impulse, whether it be from the environment, whether it be internalized, you essentially are going to use a cycle of communication. So from negative 180, anytime you begin a cycle of communication, that takes up that individual characteristic. Once you have to consider something else, then you get to negative 181. Maybe you feel emotional once that happens, that's negative 183. Then maybe you have to respond to someone, or somebody adds some other kind of information to what you're dealing with, that's negative 184. And the normal range in the Z-scale or in post-intelligent impulse is right at this limit of negative 185. So the same way that there are sort of limits in the R scale, there are limits to what we can do in post-intelligence. But really getting deep into that is best left to when we talk about these specifically. But that's essentially the range that defines what normal is. So the entire R scale sort of becomes compressed and squished into this range. And it all depends on what is needed in that situation. It depends on the environment you're in. It depends on hormones and whether you're on medications or anything like that. But this is sort of the best case scenario, is it metaphysical. But even if you go beyond that range, the brain still tries to do a few things. And that is sort of where you get pushed into the second communication type, which is referred to as impulsive communication. And the range for that is going to be from negative 186 all the way to negative 191. That's sort of the defined range of impulsive communication. And the thing that sets that apart from metaphysical communication is another physical limit, and it's called the vertical gap, which is not really displayed on the index. It's just more of something to be aware of. So the same way that the thinking types in the R scale aren't there, in the same way the individual characteristics aren't necessarily labeled. It's just something to be aware of. But it's another physical limit that's referred to as the vertical gap rather than the intelligent gap. But that is sort of the range that impulsive communication takes place. And once you get beyond that range, there is compulsive communication. So once you get from impulsive and you get beyond that range, you get to compulsive, which is essentially negative 192 all the way to negative 197. And this 197 of negative 197 characteristics of communication is literally the maximum load that you can put on the brain. After that, it's very difficult to do anything else meaningful. But defining each one of those is better left to when we get deeper into the Z-scale and how to measure each one of these and so forth. But there is still a chance that you have to deal with those things, even if you're overwhelmed, even if you handle too much information or what have you. There's still a chance that you're still going to have to function. You're still going to be awake and doing all that stuff. And to explain that, what happens during that time, it's compulsive impulse. And that is 197 plus. It's kind of negative 197 and beyond. And there's also a limit to that and so forth. But again, it's a little bit better to explain that once we get to that point. But these are all the ranges of the post-intelligent scale, or the Z scale. So moving on from the post-intelligent area, there's also rolling communication. And rolling communication is also kind of difficult to explain. And if you notice in post-intelligence here that we're going from negative to more negative, and then negative to more negative, and then negative to even more negative. That's an energy-saving kind of thing. That's sort of related to the brain trying not to overload itself and trying to conserve as much information as possible. But the other thing that you can do potentially is move in a positive direction. And it's its own sort of thing when it comes to doing that. But essentially the range that you see in rolling communication is going to start at negative 180, and it's going to move in a positive direction. And that's going to go all the way back to the gap. That's the range that rolling communication usually deals with. And that's going to go all the way back to the 117 characteristics that it takes to get to the gap, but you're going to go in a positive direction from negative. So you're starting at negative 180, and you move in a positive direction until you get that amount of consideration, or that amount of information, or that amount of activation in the brain that mimics where the gap happens to be. And there's a specific dynamic that goes along with it, and it's a little bit confusing to explain, but it's its own phenomenon, and it's essentially based on trying to access intelligence from the other end. So the problem is that the amount of energy that intelligence requires is much different than what we have available in the faculty of post-intelligence. And that mismatch leads to several problems, and that kind of defines what rolling communication is about. So anyway, beyond rolling communication, you can also go beyond the normal post-intelligent spot, and that's sort of the definition of this negative 197 plus in post-intelligence. And once you get there, you have to deal with a couple of different problems. And that's best explained by things like hormones, things like drugs and medication, alcohol, food additives, preservatives, artificial colors and flavorings. So essentially what happens in the complex range is that we sort of tax ourselves all the way through our maximum capacity, and then something else is there still kind of poking and prodding and egging you on. And that leads to something called complex communication. The other terms for those are hormone-induced compulsive impulsive impulse, and also drug-induced compulsive impulsive impulse. And that is sort of the max amount of taxing plus something else going on, some other thing that pushes you into continued stimulation when otherwise you'd kind of just get back to stillness, or just try to find a point to rest. But the other thing that can lead to that is kind of being overwhelmed socially, having too many people, or being in too big of a crowd, and other things like that. But complex range explains what happens once you get beyond there. And it's worth noting that there is a specific type of complex communication that is peculiar to women, and that is organized on something called the V scale, which isn't shown here, but it's something that is sort of denoted by this sort of slant, and that is essentially how complex communication is organized. Men can experience it as well, but it's more than likely going to be related to something like medication or drug use or something, rather than just some natural process in the way that women experience it. So while men can experience it occasionally, women are much more prone to be subject to complex communication. It's much more likely that they have to deal with complex communication than would be male. But it's not impossible, but it usually only happens temporarily. And that entire thing is described through complex communication, and it's organized on something called the V scale, or the Venus scale. So besides memory or cyclic thinking, that's essentially the entirety of the standard behavioral index. And using those tools and using this diagram right here, we can essentially address anything that we need to about behavior, about communication, and so on and so forth. And standard theory has a few assertions that it makes. If you have the book version of standard theory, I think it says hypotheses or something, but they're assertions that are made to kind of think about what to expect when it comes to the way that each of these individual characteristics are presented, how each of these ranges are expected to be displayed, and how people will tend to move through them. So before we bring up those assertions, let's just run through the behavioral index one more time. So here we have the Z0 scale. That's what's depicted here. This part of it is the R scale, or the scale of intelligence. And then here we have the Z scale, which is the scale of post-intelligence. Right in between that we have the gap, and we sort of kind of cycle through it that way. So the Z0 scale, which is pre-intelligent impulse, this is what's going to define our unit of communication, cycle of communication. And then we have the R scale, which is here. It's the faculty of intelligence. Sometimes it's just, you may hear it just generally referred to as horizontal thinking or intelligence. It's the R scale, which is short for the Rose scale, and it determines how we combine information internally. So it's all about internalizing information and handling things from there. And these lines here represent the communication types. So we have silent communication, we have intimate communication, we have social communication, we have shared communication, and supersocial communication. And all that leads up to the limit of a gap, which is right here. And the gap is what separates intelligence from post-intelligence. In post-intelligence, we have metaphysical communication, we have impulsive communication, we have compulsive communication, we have compulsive impulse. This area without any of those bars is rolling communication. And then beyond that, we have complex communication. So that is all we need as our foundational set of rules to describe whatever else we need to in psychology. And if you're familiar with all of the other theories that are out there, which psychology has about half a dozen primary school of thoughts, if you're familiar with psychodynamics, if you're familiar with behaviorism or cognitive behavior theory, if you're familiar with the humanistic side of things, the biological side of things, the social learning or the emergent theories, or any of the related things like counseling or behavior analysis or anything like that, what we want to do is try to explain all those things using this set of rules. But if you try to say psychodynamics says this and then apply it to standard theory, you're going to realize that there's going to be some dissonance there. But if you take standard theory as a foundation, what you'll find is that most of what it's saying is going to be backward compatible with all those other ideas and all those other theories. But it really takes a change in your foundational way of thinking about things to see how that works. And if you're able to do that very quickly, you may realize how much easier it could be to use this set of rules first and then try to fit everything in from there. And that's the whole purpose of standard theory, is to be a unified, singular, sort of universal way to look at all of those different problems. So it's a single set of rules, and once we get to that point, hopefully you'll see how much you can do with this without the rules changing, and how well it fits with a lot of the other theories and the other things that we've studied, and how sort of concentrated this entire symbol actually is. So what I want to do next is just introduce the assertions that standard theory makes about this whole system. And if you have the book version, it's one of the first things that's introduced. It just says that there are a few certain main ideas that go along with using this as a tool when you're actually trying to answer a question or something like that. And it just sort of allows you to think about why one thing may be happening versus another, or versus just some random thing. So these may not be in the exact same order, but they should basically be the same thing. So the first one that we have relates behavior to communication. And I'll just shorthand these as much as I can. So the first one says the behavior and communication are related. And that may seem like a really complex thing, and there are all kinds of arguments about that in traditional psychology, But that is just a simple way of saying that behavior is one thing, which is sort of our post-intelligent impulse here, and communication is one thing, which is the R scale. And they are related, even though they are separate kind of phenomenon, even though you can consider one thing or the other, they are somewhat intertwined. And the whole reason that they're intertwined is related to the second assertion, which is that there's a specific unit of communication, which is referred to as a cycle of communication. So the way to think about these is, considering a behavior that you may be doing. Maybe you're building something or you're trying to solve a puzzle, but for whatever reason you just can't get to the next step. Then there's a good chance that you go and ask somebody and you communicate with them and they give you some kind of tip or advice, and then you go back and you can complete your puzzle. So the thing that prevents you from just leaving the puzzle as is or whatever is the idea that there's a specific amount of information that you have to complete in order to feel like you can move to the next thing, that the sort of problem is resolved. And it's the same with communication. You could be trying to say something or express something or explain something to someone, but for whatever reason you may not have the words or you may not be able to get your point across. So instead you use body language or use a diagram or you use some externalized kind of thing to get that across. The whole reason that you have to do that is so that you can feel that that amount of information has been resolved. It's been communicated, and then from there you can move on to the next thing. So there's some relationship between them, and they can work together in order to complete what you think of as a cycle of communication. So those two kind of go hand in hand, but it's really important to think of them working together in order to complete this cycle of communication. So the third assertion is where the sort of tendencies and trends come in, and that is essentially constructive communication and behavior versus destructive communication and behavior. So what you tend to see when it comes to either behavior or communication or both is constructive tendencies versus destructive tendencies. And according to standard theory, constructive tendencies are related to divulging information. It's related to communicating something that you've actually gone through in order to facilitate a relationship, essentially, or to facilitate an increased amount of understanding between people. And your behavior and communication can do that. It's based on being open, and it's based on kind of telling people exactly what happened, and in a very truthful and veritable kind of way. But then there are also destructive tendencies, and destructive tendencies are designed to prevent people from understanding what you've been through. They're designed to misdirect and mislead people, and it's designed to leave something unknown. And they are just different sides of the same coin. It's not the destructive is bad, it's not the constructive is good. It is just a tendency that people have in terms of how they behave or how they tend to communicate. And there are a few more complicated combinations of those, but those are the general ones. They're just going to try to match what they've gone through to what they're communicating, or they're going to try to mismatch that kind of thing. And that's sort of the idea of constructive communication and behavior versus destructive communication and behavior. So the fourth assertion deals with the limits. There's only so much that you can do in any given faculty at any given time. That's sort of what that assertion is referring to. So in the faculty of impulse, there's only so much that you can store in memory before there's some kind of problem. Same with the faculty of intelligence. There are only so many times that you can combine information. And same with the faculty of post-intelligence. There are only so many times that you can try to make meaning out of a situation and respond to it and so forth without something getting in the way. And most of them are physical limits. Most of them are based on what we have available to us, and it's based on the capacity that the brain has. So even though in randomness things may seem infinite, whenever we organize things this way, we see some very hard and fast limits. And some are based on neurochemistry, some are based on physiological structures that we have to do that, and so forth. But for the most part, what we're going through is not going to be considered completely random nor completely infinite. And that's sort of what the assertion sort of addresses. So the fifth one deals with abnormal or non-standard. And that's the idea that the behavioral index is only addressing the best case scenario. The standard behavioral index is only looking at what is completely congruent, what is completely optimized, and what is completely normal. So anytime you deviate from that in any amount, even just a little bit, you can consider that deviation to be an abnormal version of that. And one really cool thing about the behavioral index is it is still symmetric in that way. So even if you're looking at a specific characteristic, there's going to be a standard version of it, which means that's the best case scenario, or sort of a thing that trends from low to high, more or less. Or there's going to be a non-standard version of it, meaning that you lack some amount of energy, you lack some amount of information, or you're sort of going from high to low, at least in the R scale, those two examples. So anything that is not the exact unit can be considered abnormal, and that's how you can define things like mental illness, that's how you can define problems with memory, and that's how you can more or less address any kind of symptom or whatever. And the idea is that if it's not the exact amount of information that is defined by standard theory, that it's essentially going to be abnormal. So the sixth assertion deals with the goal. So there actually is an end game to all this. There actually is something that people are working toward or working away from. But there is a goalpost, as it were, to all this stuff. So the sixth assertion says that the main thing that people are trying to do is achieve a certain process. And that process is referred to as constructive intimacy. And it's a little bit confusing because it's not the same as constructive versus destructive. In constructive intimacy, that term just means that you actually go through the dynamic of intimacy. And that goalpost is right here. It's right here. This is where you're trying to get to. And this represents where constructive intimacy happens. That's the goal. So the tendency is to go from our unit through all of the things that we need to get through intelligence, and then experience whatever is going on right there, and then you kind of have to back away from that. And once you back away from there, going kind of back in this direction, you kind of have to choose where to go from there. But people are either trying to actively avoid this, or that's what they're trying to go toward. So if you think about it kind of in a deep philosophical way, the only thing that we know for sure from science and imaging that's going on in our minds is a bunch of different sort of flashes and synapses and stuff. But the way that we apply meaning to that is sort of based on what is meaningful to us. So the only thing we're trying to do is find another person who can understand that otherwise random, meaningless kind of thing. And in doing so, we're able to sort of recognize people for, what they're going through rather than for some other reason. So that's all that we are really able to communicate is what's going on sort of at that level. And some people really want to have that known to others, and some people really don't. And that's sort of the idea versus constructive versus destructive. But when it comes to constructive intimacy, it's either actively participating in it or actively avoiding it. But either way, that's the goalpost. That's essentially what we're trying to do. And whenever you're thinking about why a person's going through something in super social communication or orthogonal thinking or why they're going through something metaphysically or anything like that. That's sort of what they're trying to get back around to, is getting to the point where they're going through constructive intimacy. So that's essentially what we consider the end game of what our sort of thing is. And it's related to not just experiencing it, but interpreting the meaning from the entire experience of constructive intimacy. And I would argue that the way that we apply meaning to that entire experience is more important than just experiencing it itself. So those are the primary assertions that standard theory makes when trying to figure out why any one of these individual units occurs in the way that it does. So the first assertion relates the R scale to the Z scale, and sort of explains how they work together to complete a cycle of communication. And that leads to the second assertion, which defines the cycle of communication as one unit of experience. And the third assertion is sort of constructive versus destructive tendencies, and that's sort of working toward the goal or away from the goal, very, very generally. And the fourth assertion are the limits. So that's one of the limits. The gap is one of the limits. The sort of compulsive, impulsive into complex communication is a limit. The vertical gap is a limit. So there are certain limits that are involved in the index. And the fifth assertion says that anything that doesn't follow that specific pattern is going to be abnormal. And it makes it very easy to determine what abnormal may be. And then finally, the goal of everything is expressing ourselves and explaining ourselves to another person in a way that the other person can understand. So those are the primary assertions that standard theory makes, and it's the behavioral index. And using these, we can address essentially anything that we need to in behavior and in communication and so on. And it may not be kind of readily apparent as to how that works, but as we go on to demonstrate some of the things, as we go on to define the different traditional diseases to the criteria that standard theory has, and as we go on to address different phenomenon in different studies, we can do so using this set of rules only. We don't really deviate from this. The only exception to that is defining everything in a non-standard way, but it looks exactly the same. It's just that you determine whether one thing is standard or non-standard, kind of different sides of the same coin. So doing that will allow us to address the enormous field that psychology has become. So the other thing I want to talk about for getting into the definition of each characteristic and all that stuff is memory. And in standard theory, that is organized through something called cyclic thinking. And cyclic thinking defines how the units of experience are actually stored within the brain. And in the book version, I think they're only addressed in a non-standard way. So I want to go ahead and address the standard levels of memory. And there are a few of them, and it starts with the zero factor. And the zero factor is kind of philosophical. There's essentially information out there that you won't really ever be exposed to in a direct kind of sense in terms of environments and other things like that. So it's kind of a deep sort of philosophical way to think about things that really don't have a probability or a chance of being stored in memory. But the first level is circular thinking, and that deals with sort of the most basic form of observing information in the environment. And there's essentially just one center of focus to that. So you kind of have some variable, and you kind of have your attention on that one variable. And that's essentially all circular thinking is. And the term that's used in the non-standard way is something called a disruption. And a disruption is part of the components of impulse that don't complete themselves. That's kind of the term that you use, is a disruption in the non-standard sense. But in the standard sense, it's something that you can refer to as circular thinking. Then there's ovular thinking, And obvious thinking has two centers of focus. So there's something that you've already become aware of at that point. There's some circular aspect to it, and then there's a new aspect to it. So essentially what the brain does during obvious thinking is it determines whether it needs to keep the circle the same or whether it needs to add a new consideration to those sort of stored memories. And in this case, we're thinking that at least one of these dots is already part of circular thinking. We're imagining kind of moving the circular dot down to here, and then comparing what we've already experienced or what we've already stored in memory to a new event. So this would kind of be like the new event. And the same with circular thinking. That initial circle is going to be the new event. And that's kind of how we think about comparing these two things. And this works very closely with actually going through the components of impulse, which sort of determines how to apply meaning and how similar the new event is to the original event and so on and so forth. But if we determine that these are somehow related in a way that is not exactly the same but still kind of similar enough to apply meaning to the new event, then you get sort of two centers of focus, and that becomes sort of ovular. But it does depend on whether or not those two are similar or not. But the next step of this is elliptical communication. And what we have here is moving this entire ovular thing down to here, and then here we'll have a new event. And now what we have to try to do is figure out whether one of these two can be replaced with a new event, or if it's similar enough that we don't have to worry about replacing one of those. But that's essentially what's going on in elliptical thinking, and that's sort of like long-term thinking. That's where standard theory organizes things like muscle memory and sort of the deeply seated and deeply held beliefs and that kind of thing. But what you're doing now is comparing the new event to whatever's here. And it makes it very difficult to change because there's a chance that what you already know is sufficient enough and you can just sort of ignore whatever's happening new. Or the other sort of thing is that whatever's new can either replace or fit in with one of those previously stored events. That's kind of the idea. And you sort of have these two sort of equal, somewhat equally distant sort of centers of focus, along with a third new event that's being compared to them. So the next level is incongruent thinking, and it can happen in a couple different ways. But essentially what you're going to have is some elliptical event, and then you're going to have some kind of new event, and then you're going to have something else going on over here. And this could be a circular event, it could be another part of an ovular event, it could be another elliptical event, or it could be another new event. So it's just kind of an extra variable that we have. And one reason this could happen is that this elliptical event is not well defined. So maybe there's some missing information there. Maybe for whatever reason there are multiple kind of unresolved ideas there. Maybe there's basically not enough information. But for whatever reason, instead of comparing something that is well seated in long-term memory with a new event, you could be comparing something that's not well seated with something new, and then having another variable either to decide how those are related or what have you. So essentially there's just too much going on at any given time to really define how these should interact with one another, and which of these needs to go into here, if one of these needs to leave and another one has to come in, or one of these switches with that. There's just too much going on, and that's just referred to as incongruent thinking. So the way that kind of we define limits to those other things is sort of going to put the limit of standard experience at elliptical thinking, and incongruent thinking is kind of going to go beyond that limit. And the reason that this is important is going to become more apparent when you think about the severity of a problem. So traditionally, I think the severity of problems is how long it's been going on and the number of symptoms. And you can kind of relate that to this as well. But in terms of standard theory, it's going to depend on how deeply seated that problem is. So all this stuff you can think of as standard, but in a non-standard way, we can think of these instead of dots, kind of formal sort of dots. We can think of them as like maybe some weird shape, like a weird star, or you can think of one of these as like a weird star, and then a square, and maybe instead of that, you'll have 2 stars here, and then here is going to be like a triangle or something. And then by the time it gets incongruent, you know, the things you could have are like a star, a triangle, a square, and then a dot. It just sort of depends. But if you think of the standard unit, all these are going to be the same. They're all going to have the exact amount of information in them. They're all going to be resolved in the same way. They're all going to be stored in the same way. And it makes it very easy to compare and contrast which one is which. But when you get to the point where you're dealing with alternate sort of things, you know, non-standard versions of the things, it's a little more difficult to tell how closely related they are. It's kind of difficult to compare them because they're not as easily similar. It's very easy to say that they're not similar, but it's not very easy to say how closely related they are. The same way that you would if you were just comparing similar information. So whenever you have some kind of problem or mental illness or disease or whatever, it really depends on how far that is sort of seated in memory. And in the book version, incongruent, at that level, instead of it being incongruent thinking, the disease process of that is referred to as a disease. And in elliptical thinking, the disease process is referred to as an illness. It's at that level. At ovular, it's just referred to as a derangement. And at circular, it's referred to as a disruption. So in the non-standard sense, it's disruption, derangement, illness, and the true disease. And each one of those has its own associated phenomenon in the standard sense and the non-standard sense. But those are just the levels of memory, and that's sort of the way that standard theory organizes them. So anytime that you experience a characteristic or you create a new characteristic or so on, anytime that you're dealing with something in the environment, you're either going to be storing it, you're going to be comparing it to something, and then you're trying to figure out which of those is more closely related. So that really sort of shows how memory is involved in making these sort of new kind of experiences and so forth, and how it can become problematic, especially when trying to learn new things or trying to change behaviors and so forth. And it really just depends on the level at which memory is stored in that standard or non-standard sense. But that basically allows us to answer what we need to, from the Z-naught scale to the R scale to the Z scale, and then how each of those individual phenomenon becomes stored in memory. And that also allows us to define the severity of the disease and so forth. So that's essentially cyclic thinking. My name is Damon Rose. I'm the author of The Standard Theory of Psychology, and I'd like to thank a few people for making this possible. I'd like to thank Dr. Woodley and UTPB. I'd like to thank Dr. Jim Olson. I'd like to thank Dr. Babcock. I'd like to thank the Office of Student Research and their staff. I'd like to thank the Roden Center at UTPB. I'd like to thank my grandparents, Albert and Rosa. And I'd also like to thank my mom, Alma. Thank you.